Senator Rice.
Thank you, Mr Acting Deputy President. I attended the Melbourne climate rally yesterday and it was an inspiring place to be. 30,000 people out there in force, from old people, young people, across the whole sector of society. I was particularly inspired by the number of young people that were there, and inspired by the fact that the Melbourne rally was beginning a worldwide wave of rallies for climate action. All of those young people that were there, because they knew that it was their futures that were at stake, and they were wanting political leadership, they were wanting community leadership for real action, not words, on climate change. One of the things that inspired me the most at the rally yesterday too was when the rally organisers announced that the UN Secretary-General, Ban Ki-moon, was going to be attending and marching with the people who have been rallying in New York, amongst the 300,000 to 400,000 people who are rallying in New York. This places Prime Minister Abbott's refusal to go to the UN Climate Summit in stark relief. It's important that our Prime Minister goes. It's symbolic that our head of government goes, because it states that this is an important action. Being inspired by those young people at the rally yesterday reminded me of my experience as a young person, politicised by climate change, when I learnt about climate change as a 20-year-old at university and decided that I had to take action because the world needed to be doing something about it. That was over 30 years ago. Lots of things have changed in the 30 years since then. Then the science was in its infancy. The first Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change report wasn't released until 1990. Then most political and community leaders didn't know the science. Renewable technology was in its infancy too, so it really seemed like a wicked problem that we were dealing with. How are we going to overcome this? But what hasn't changed in the 30 years since then was the realisation that acting on climate change was going to impact on the world and Australia's use of coal and gas and oil. And as the years went by, this was where the debate focused. And the debate focused on whether we were going to have economic impacts versus environmental impacts. Did we have to choose between keeping our economic development and jobs and our way of life versus damage to the environment? But sadly, I think that this is where the government's still at. They are stuck in the past, haven't been paying attention to what's changed, and the 21st century perspective that it's no longer an issue of the environment versus the economy. And if the Prime Minister was up with the times, he would know that we're on track for 4 degrees of warming, which will be an ongoing global disaster, not just environmentally, but also economically. The impacts of 4 degrees of warming, hotter than humans have ever known it before, more extreme floods, storms, cyclones, bushfires, melting polar ice caps, farmlands around the world being hotter and drier, meaning that billions of people won't be able to grow enough food or have enough water to stay healthy, lack of food and water causing wars and millions of refugees. This is going to be economically and socially disastrous. All of these impacts are going to have massive economic impacts, which are unacceptable to the Australian and global community and disastrous to the Australian and world economy. If Prime Minister Tony Abbott was to attend the summit, he would be learning that every global agency knows that this is so, and that has changed since I've been involved in this climate change debate. Then we felt that agencies like the World Bank, the World Economic Forum, the International Monetary Fund had very different attitudes toward climate change than I did as a climate activist. But now every one of those agencies know that it's in the world's economic as well as environmental and social interest to be getting deep and meaningful action and urgent action on climate change. The World Bank released a report in June that said fighting climate change would help grow the world economy, adding up to $2.6 trillion a year in global GDP in the coming decades. It's a sharp contrast with the government's claims that fighting climate change would clobber the economy. If the Prime Minister was there at the climate summit, these are the perspectives that he would learn. The World Bank report also said that the pro-climate regulations and tax incentives would on their own deliver nearly a third of the reductions in greenhouse gas emissions needed to keep warming below the 2-degree threshold for dangerous climate change. So that's why the Prime Minister, it seems that's why our Prime Minister isn't going, because he's got his eyes and ears closed. He doesn't want to know, he doesn't want to hear. In Australia, what the impact of acting on climate change that the government needs to realise is that it means tackling the fossil fuel lobby. That's what our government is not willing to do, because that means tackling the coal industry. It means actually doing more than the fig leaf of direct action. And Australia has over a quarter of the world's coal reserves. We are a huge player in the coal industry. There was new research out today about coal that identified major financial risks for investors in coal producers around the world, and highlighting that there are $112 billion of future coal mine expansion development that is excess to requirements over lower demand forecasts because of slowing demand growth in China. And in particular, this research shows that high-cost new mines are not economic at today's prices and are unlikely to generate returns for investors in the future, and that companies most exposed to low coal demand are those developing new projects focused on the export market. They are the projects, the Galilee Basin, the other coal export projects, that our government should be saying no to if they were serious about action on climate change. The other thing that's changed, and which the Prime Minister would be learning about if he attended the summit, was, and that we on this side know about acting on climate, is that renewables are now the most cost-effective way of dealing with our energy issues. We know that the cost of renewables is coming down, and we know that not investing in renewables means that we are losing the potential for jobs. Over 1,000 jobs potentially being lost just in my state of Victoria if, for example, we get rid of the renewable energy target. So it's clear we need to be taking action on climate. Australia needs to be a leader in taking action on climate. We need to be there in New York putting our case as part of the global community rather than living in the past. The science is clear. We need zero carbon as soon as possible, no later than 2050. The Climate Change Authority's reduction targets of 40 to 60% by 2020 are achievable, are reachable, and that's what we need to be aiming for. Our 5% target, in contrast, is inadequate, and in particular, not only is it inadequate for 2020, but there's no potential for it to be expanded beyond then. In my first speech, I laid out 6 steps that I think that we needed to be taking if we were going to be taking real action on climate change, that Australia as part of the world community, joining as part of the world community, needs to be taking. They were to set pollution reduction targets based on the science. That's what we need to be doing. To stop subsidising fossil fuels. Clearly, all around the world, it's going to be a really big driver in how we are going to be reducing and to be getting the shift that we need to renewables and away from fossil fuels. We need to be creating more jobs by boosting clean energy production and energy conservation. We need to start closing coal-fired power stations. We are in a position where we have an excess of power, we can afford to be doing it, and the dirtiest coal-fired power stations we should be taking action to be closing. Hazelwood and the Alcoa power stations in Victoria are the 2 key ones, certainly from a Victorian perspective. We need to be saying no to new coal and gas exports, coal seam gas and other unconventional gas. And we need to be making the big polluters pay. We had a price on carbon, it was working. I'm sure at the UN Climate Summit we'll be learning about the benefits that a price on carbon will be having all around the world. Our price on carbon reduced our carbon emissions by 2% in just a year. These are the sorts of measures that Australia, as part of We used to be a global leader. When I came into this Senate, I was proud to be joining a party and joining a parliament and joining the Greens that had strong action that was going to be tackling climate change. We no longer are that. We need to be there on the world stage, putting our case for urgent, serious action, acting on climate change. Thank you.
Thank you.